It is part of Jesus' gospel that you have an executive center. Dallas Willard used to say of his students at USC that many of them came into his classes not knowing that they had a will. What they thought they had was DNA or a nervous system or a brain, and that's what accounted for their actions. Well, we today in Europe may not be so dominated by that materialism of Dallas Willard's students, but understanding the will in human life is just as difficult for us. We may say that we were born with it, or that we have a particular socialization, or that we are a part of certain power structures of sort of rich and poor and race and gender and all this sort of thing that dictates what we do, or especially what other people do. Well, unless you know that you have an executive center, you're probably not going to be able to make much sense of what Jesus is talking about. Hey everybody, welcome to the Sanctus Forum. I am Michael Stewart Robb, better known as Mike, and we are here talking about a book called The Divine Conspiracy by Dallas Willard. And if you want to talk about books that mix together philosophy, psychology, theology, and just good common sense, then you should subscribe to this channel and join us as we read this. Get a copy if you don't have one already. And turn to chapter 3, which is where we are, and we're talking about a section called the Centrality of Will and Heart. Now, this chapter was very difficult for Dallas Willard to write, and I'll read a little letter to his editor that he wrote about it. He says, "I haven't rewritten chapter 3 100 times yet, and it will be the rawest part of what you have here. My main trouble with this chapter is that it keeps trying to become a book in its own right. I think that this chapter is very crucial for the entire project." Well, I think the reason why it tried to become a book in its own right was because so few people are talking about these issues that Dallas felt that he had to talk about them all himself and put them all into this chapter. And it all gets said pretty quickly and with not a lot of explanation. So we're going to try to tease out some of these ideas, which you can find in Dallas's other writings, and you can find in his talks. One of his other writings, if you read Dallas, you'll know this, Renovation of the Heart. This is where some of this stuff from this chapter actually gets a much more thorough discussion. He hadn't written that book yet at this time, so he can't exactly refer to it, but he's trying to get some of these things onto the table. Now, as in the last video, we're talking about the spiritual. What is it? What does it mean that things are spiritual? And Dallas has gone through a few things. It's not physical. It has something to do with power, probably ultimate power, thoughts, valuing, and then he slips in will there, and that's what he's going to talk about in this section here. Now, he calls will, the will aspect of personal spiritual reality is its innermost core. When people talk about spirit or spirituality, do they have in mind the will? Or turn it around. When people start talking about the will and choices, what is that? Is that matter? Is that what that is? See, Dallas is trying to bring these two things together because really he sees them as one and the same thing. I guess you can say that spirit is bigger than will, but there's no such thing as spirit that doesn't include will. And therefore, if you want to talk about spiritual and spirituality, you need to get in there and talk about will. Spiritual is personal. Personal means wills. And we're going to be jumping around here a little bit, but Dallas has a few other words for this. One place he calls it self-determination and also freedom and creativity. Now, when you listen to Dallas Willard, like, for example, if you listen to him in a philosophy class, he might talk a lot about freedom or agency, and really what he's talking about is will, he's talking about spirit, he's talking about self-determination. Likewise, creativity, another one of his favorite words. You just have to sort of watch him a little bit and see how terms sort of compare to each other and overlap. So jump ahead to the next page, at least for me, and he starts talking again about God, and he talks about God's self-sufficiency. Now, this isn't a big part of this book, but it is an important part for Dallas's thinking, God as a being that doesn't need anything else to exist. He exists in his own right and of his own resources. That's God's self-sufficiency. He also calls it here God's self-determination. And they are the same thing. They just do tend to refer to different aspects of God. But notice that word, self-determination. That is will. That is heart. And by the way, God and human beings are the only things in the Bible that are referred to as heart, as having heart. So one of the things that I would do is switch the terminology around as you read this chapter. So, for example, when Dallas is talking about creative people, and you might think, I'm not a creative person, I don't do that. But if you switch that to freedom, it really may tend to include you more than you think it does. For example, he says sometimes the creativity is a matter of steadfast faithfulness to ideals or relationships. Well, if you call that freedom, and you realize sometimes our freedom is a matter of steadfast faithfulness to ideals or relationships, you realize that some people really use their freedom in very consistent, very faithful ways, and that is an expression of who they are. It is a creative expression of who they are, and that's why we cherish that in people, and we tell stories about that kind of thing. Well, of course, God has that kind of creativity, that kind of freedom as well, that freedom in faithfulness to particular ideals or to particular relationships. God is creative in his faithfulness to Abraham and Abraham's people. That's a sort of biblical theme in that vein. But of course, in God, these things are much more full, much more rich than they are in us. God's self-determination is ultimate. God's self-sufficiency is ultimate. But Dallas wants to say that we also have a measure of that which God has, and God has an infinite measure of that which we have. We too have a degree of self-sufficiency and of self-determination. Now, these are extremely limited in our cases and really are ultimately dependent on God. Our self-sufficiency, our ability to exist in our own right, is dependent on the fact that God created us. Try to think about how you would depend upon yourself for your own existing. It's not really something that we human beings do. One other thing I want to point out before I leave you here is Dallas starts talking about kingdom in the last two paragraphs here. And that's something back from the first chapter, which we have talked about like 2 years ago. So you can go back and you can listen to those videos as well. There is also a podcast to this, by the way. But he says here, I don't know, lots of things about our kingdom. Now, what you can do is just take kingdom and right next to it will. And you just remember that Dallas, he's just using different terminology really for the same thing. And sometimes the terminology means the same thing in a slightly different way. But you have to sort of catch these things. So I'll read one. We saw how grace, through confidence in Jesus, permits our kingdom, our will, to grow into a union with the kingdom, the will of God. Cool, huh? Well, I want to know, what don't you understand about this section? Give me a question, if you can, in the comments. If there's something that just puzzles you, let me know, and we'll try to deal with as many questions as possible. I assume that there are some because he has just smashed a lot into this section. It really could have been a whole book, but it's not. And so that leaves lots of room for us to talk about these things and discuss them. Subscribe if that's what you want to be doing with us over the next years, it seems. And until then, bye.